Hi, I'm Katie with Modern Textiles, and today I'm going to go over how to manage your scrap stash, as well as how to make any quilt pattern a scrappy quilt. So let's get started. I would say, 3 methods of managing my scraps, and it's really just the various state of where I am at in the whole sewing space. So am I like cranking out quilts left and right? Then you'll see me with this big tote of just random offcuts. It might even be partial strip quilts or strip blocks, leftover jelly roll strips, really anything that I'm working on. If I'm really in the mood to just cut a quilt, cut a quilt, I don't really take any time to sort or manage my scraps. So they'll just go into this giant bucket tote, which is a formation bucket tote. You can grab that in the shop. The formation quilt pattern comes with the bucket tote instructions inside. So once I have all these scraps and I'm kind of feeling not burnt out of my sewing, but that it's gonna start making me overwhelmed if I see it too much, I then move into sorting out my scraps. So I'm gonna show you a couple of buckets I have for that. 2 out of, I believe, 12 pretty much plastic bin storage containers I have under my long arm. I've got them sorted out with like whites, neutrals, what do I use for maybe background fabric. I've got blues, greens, teals, oranges, just you name it. I've got 12 of this size drawers that I put all my scraps into. So literally, if I find something that's blue, well, some of these orphan blocks, I have another place to put those because you never know. Maybe you'll end up making a super scrappy quilt with just orphan blocks. So I hang on to those. But when you come across something that reads, this might be a little too much gray, I might toss this into my gray bucket or into the white. Sometimes if it's super scrappy, I'm not too concerned. As long as the main base color reads whatever bin you're putting in, that's kind of how I operate. The next thing I do, this is a lot of scrap strip pieces. There we go. So this one, for sure, base white, it's got some Halloween colors sprinkled in there. I'm gonna take this one out so I don't accidentally leave it in there. And then I just put them into my white. I keep all scraps that are about 2 inches or bigger, because I can use them for really scrappy strip piecing quilts. Otherwise, anything that's 2.5 and bigger, I put these into the bins. Orphan blocks I have in their own separate little bin, as well as anything that's 2 inches or bigger, like strip piecing for good scrappy type quilts. I keep those in a separate bin because I know it's going to be really difficult for me to use a 2-inch piece in a standard quilt pattern. And then if I'm feeling really motivated to get my scraps under control, which has happened like very seldomly in my life, I then will trim down these scraps into very common squares and rectangles. So let me grab those for you. So here's my bins for scraps that I've trimmed down. I've trimmed them down to charm pack size, which is perfect for this confetti quilt that I've got. It's a free tutorial. You can sign up and get that yourself. It called for a full charm pack, but because I had scraps that were already cut, I was able to just use scraps in place of a charm pack, which is always fun to be able to use those scraps. And then all of this gray background, so all this gray background is actually offcuts of Y-back fabric from previous quilts that I've quilted up. So totally scrappy. I think I even had 2 pieces of this fireside that I use to make it an entirely scrappy quilt from front to back. I also cut them into 3.5-inch squares. I feel like this is becoming a bit more commonplace to use 3.5-inch for scrappy backgrounds. They're bigger than your typical mini charm pack, but smaller than your charm pack, and they give a nice variety of color in any type of quilt. So I actually used to have a third bin here for pretty much mini charm cuts, 2.5-inch squares, but I've already gone through. I'm going to be making my veggie quilt, which calls out in the pattern the number of 2.5-inch squares of each color that you need. So that's kind of where you go into when you're checking out a quilt pattern. Once you've bought it, typically they're not going to list out all your cuts needed on the back of the pattern there. So what you're going to want to do is go into the cut instructions once you already have once you've already bought your pattern and you know you've got a crazy stash of scraps like me, then you can go in and either the chart might be provided by you if the designer promoted it as a scrappy quilt. There might just be quantities of how many pieces of fabric you might need. Otherwise, if you're completely doing your own scrappy quilt and it's not called out as a scrappy quilt, you can still make it a scrappy quilt, right? How many times can I say scrappy in 30 seconds? That's just bananas what I just did. So with this, typically you're going to have in any type of quilt pattern, they're going to call out the number of width of fabrics that you need to cut and then how many to subcut from that width of fabrics, leaving you with the number of quantity of blocks you need in order to piece that quilt. So when you go into your quilt pattern, look at the cutting instructions and then read through the quilt. That's always the best practice, right? Read through the quilt pattern front to back before you start your quilt. And then if you're making it scrappy, you're just going to want to have a pencil handy. Make sure that you go through the cutting instructions and cut out all the quantity, say squares, rectangles, whatever it may be. Just make sure that you're pulling from, say if it's background fabric and they've got width of fabric subcut to 36, 1.5 inch squares or whatever it might be, that you're sticking with that color scheme. And then move on to your fabric B, do the same thing. The one thing you do want to look out for is when they're strip piecing in the pattern, you'll just notice that there'll be width of fabrics in the cutting chart and no subcuts below that. That's because you're typically going to use that for strip piecing down the road in the actual quilt assembly. If you come across strip piecing, don't freak out. You could still make it scrappy, right? You just need to bounce down to the strip piecing instructions in the quilt pattern and then go ahead and quantify how many, say 2.5 inch squares on either side of another 2.5 inch square. If you're making some sort of Irish chain, if you will, you'll just need to manually make each of those little strip blocks rather than just flying by and doing strip piecing, which if you don't know what strip piecing is, I've got a totally different video on that. But just make sure, if you see strip piecing, you're just going to have to do a little bit more math to see how many actual squares you need for everything, or rectangles, and then you'll just have to manually piece all of those tiny subcuts from the strip piece rather than just slice and dice along 40 inch or 42 inch with a fabric. And I'll see you in the next video where I explain long arm quilting.